Hey, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me and some of our Valiant team. And we have a very special guest today. We have Leonard Navarro and Jimmy Hatzel from our great partner, Scout. They are an awesome cybersecurity company. They do some really interesting and really fascinating stuff. We're so excited to have them here. Before we dive in, I just want to say thanks to everyone for liking, subscribing, checking out our YouTube page and our content that we put together. We love feedback. Please let us know if you have any questions, any things you want us to answer. Submit it. We love doing it. We're Valiant. We're an IT service provider here in New York. But we have clients all over the country, and today we're going to talk about cyber liability insurance. It's one of those topics that keep coming up. People get renewals, they ask questions. There's so much going on in it here. Usually, but before we get into cyber liability insurance, what it is, how you use it, hopefully you don't have to use it, and kind of answer questions. I'm going to hand it over to Justin with the download about some topical things today.
So the big news recently, if you haven't heard, is the Colonial pipeline ransomware incident. The short version of that being that a industrial fuel pipeline was shut down because they were attacked with ransomware. Now, this might be high profile because of who the victim is in this, but this is a very similar story for many, many small businesses. And one of the key pieces of that is the target in this attack was not the industrial control systems. If you think about like back in the Stuxnet and those types of things where it was geared specifically at the equipment that was performing the industrial work. This was the office network that got ransomware, cryptolockered, and didn't have a backup. This could have been from something as simple as somebody clicking the wrong email link or downloading the wrong file or something along those lines. And with these types of things, the term state-sponsored gets used, and that while that is in some ways accurate, it does make it sound like these types of things are, government organizations waging a dark war against other countries by going after key industrial pieces. And it's really, in a lot of ways, that's not all that accurate. It more resembles well-funded organized crime, where if you think about, the old gangster movies, pay your protection money or something bad's going to happen. This is the opposite. Something bad happened to you, so pay your money the ransom money to get it fixed. And this is something that nation states will leverage and will use as just a general way to disrupt economies of their enemies, but it's not necessarily targeted in that way. Because this isn't targeted and it really is targets of opportunity, that means that every business in some level has some level of risk, and every business needs to find the right balance between what protections they need and what's an acceptable risk. And I think a great example of this analogy that I use all the time is my car is over 10 years old. I don't think I have anything in there worth stealing. I don't even have my CDs in there anymore. So there's nothing good in there for anybody to take. But when I go to a parking lot and get out of the car, I still lock my doors. Because if somebody's walking around the parking lot and just grabs an open door, they might want to take something. They might try to steal my car. They might do something with it. But if I put up even the most bare minimum of resistance that the doors are locked, they might just pass by because there's going to be something easier to do. And a lot of the cybersecurity protections and tools that go in place follow the same kind of idea. You want to put protections in place, not necessarily because you think that you are specifically a target, but to make you a less valuable opportunity. With that in mind, we are seeing, though, a shift in sort of a free-for-all, like everybody figuring out it on their own, to some government direction on what to do. I think it was yesterday, President Biden issued an executive order that establishes new rules for government agencies. So not necessarily impacting small businesses directly yet, but this is laying the framework and policies and regulations that are going to apply to private businesses as well. It really is a signal that things are coming down the line, where there will be at some point regulations that businesses will have to follow to ensure that they're protecting them. Similar to how, your office has to meet fire code and you have to meet OSHA code, there very likely could be a cybersecurity code that businesses are required to meet in order to be allowed to conduct business. In the meantime, though, it's important for small businesses to evaluate their cybersecurity stance, evaluate what their level of acceptable risk is, and find ways to put things in place to help protect them so that they can continue to do the business that they do. And that's this week's download.
Nice.
Awesome. Thanks, JP. That's really great. That's great. And so, and if you're kind of following the whole idea of risk, what is insurance but a transference of risk from you to the insurance company who's taking on some of the risk? So before we dive into what cyber liability insurance is, and this is obviously why do you need it, right? Jimmy, Leonard, you guys deal with this day in, day out. I mean, you see this on the kind of talent. Why would a company need this? Like, why would a company need cyber liability insurance? I mean, obviously not the obvious reasons, but like, in a very quick and dirty, how? Why?
Yeah, thanks, George. So essentially, the pipeline conversation is a good example. It's the kind of thing that your average American doesn't worry about until suddenly you don't have gasoline, or your perception is that there is no more gasoline. So cyber liability insurance, guarantees, E&O policies, all of those are meant to kick in when something either goes wrong or perceptively goes wrong. Now, the problem in the industry right now, and the reason Scout is looking at this, is because we're seeing the market move towards liability insurance and guarantees and sort of more robust insurance policies in general, is partly because there are starting to be more issues. SolarWinds is a great example. And a lot of those really big policies that people are paying a fortune for, they're not paying out. And so the reason they're not paying out is because when your broker, or particularly your underwriter, starts putting together these policies, it's really hard to understand what their knowledge of cybersecurity is. So when we start to look at policies, the thing I notice is that there are certain timestamps, there are certain SLAs that don't necessarily comport with what you need when you wake up one morning and you're under a ransomware attack.
Right.
So what we've tried to look at is, outside of actual cyber liability insurance, outside of E&O policies, can we guarantee our products in the event that something happens? Now, that may mean that if you go down on hour one of the attack, we want to make sure you get X amount of dollars within 24 hours so you can make moves, you can get things remediated. And, your average cyber attack is going to cost an SMB $21,000. 52% of data breaches are caused by an employee. 60% of SMBs go out of business following attack. And there's been a 200% rise over the last year. So we're all going to need it. We're all going to have it. It's coming down the pipeline.
Especially when you combine that stat of a company being attacked, going out of business, 60% go out of business, combined with the kind of long tail of COVID, and especially if you're in an industry that was affected by the kind of COVID, it's a kind of recipe for disaster, for even more business disruption, joblessness. You start snowballing it, and it becomes this thing that you could put theoretically millions of people out of work, or an inability to work, or disrupt their lives because of some simple things that are not being kind of best practices and fundamentals.
Yeah, and I would urge people, as you're putting together bigger policies, there are very specific differences in the language. So business continuity versus an endpoint attack are different things. Business you can be exfiltrated of $1 million, and that's a horrible thing. But if your downtime and your loss of data is 2 months, you're going to lose a lot more than $1 million, depending on the size of your business. So it's very specific to look at those terms within the policies, which is why I think it behooves a lot of organizations, talk to your vendors, talk to your MSPs, see where their coverage is, because the market's maturing. And I think there's going to be, certainly by the end of the summer, end of this year, a lot more movement and companies saying, you know what, those big policies for those Fortune 1000s, they're great. They have a lot of holes in them, but those guys are going to be fine. The SMBs, on the other hand, they need some level of coverage that's fair.
Yeah.
That fits neatly to their job, their needs, and getting that place. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and the thing is, and I find this, just doing a lot of this insurance reviews for folks, it is such a wide variety of what is covered, right? And like when we look at it, it could be from, as you said, it could be this business continuity planning, it could be this breach remediation, it could be the PR phase afterwards, communication, which I think that is highly underrated or understated. Like if you're a consumer brand and you had a breach, how do you get your consumer trust back? What happens then? And I think all those pieces are, and there's this whole structure of things that have to happen that I think that people feel like, well, I have insurance, I'll take care of it. Like, but that's not necessarily it's absolutely not the right way of doing it.
And it's why we like working with partners and you guys in particular, is because if an organization is using the tools which we provide, so we're talking security monitoring, email protection, endpoint protection, it's going to be a lot easier to insure them. And because there's so many breaches happening, what we're hearing from the underwriters and the insurance companies is, hey, if they're not ticking these boxes, we don't really think we need to cover them. And when you look at the actual dollars per month it could cost a company, we're talking $25 a month to be able to get a $500,000 policy for when things go wrong. So pennies on the loss,
Correct. And actually, it's interesting you say about the checking the boxes. There's so many places that you may think are covered, but, and I think, and unfortunately, I find, you put your entrepreneur hat on versus your kind of like risk adverse IT person, or, I always laugh about being a paranoid IT guy, but, the entrepreneur's like, well, it's not going to happen to me. We'll be fine. We'll figure it out. I think, and many business owners kind of have that, that kind of mindset. And unfortunately, that really kind of bites you when you're not really ready. And they say like, well, we found that people, well, let's check boxes on underwriting, like everything's encrypted. What? Like, do you know what that means? And then some of the basics. So I mean, we put some common pitfalls that we see is that there's no written policy for any of this. No one took the time to say, well, what data are we collecting? Do we have data? So. Ray, thank you. No, yeah, right. There is no paranoid IT. Is if you're not paranoid in IT, exactly, a bad one. Thank you, Ray. Straight under your job. But I think that it's really interesting, and there's so many common pitfalls where like there's no written policies. There's they're not even doing the basics or working with a partner to implement the basics, right? So
that's one that I see all the time too, is not knowing what data you have and whether or not that, like, not knowing that you have PII or that you have sensitive data. How would you know if that data got exfiltrated if you don't even know that you have it and where it is?
Right.
Yeah, I think it's especially hard for small to medium businesses because they might not necessarily have that person, and that's why having a good partner is great. I mean, even if you aren't working with Valiant, we have a cybersecurity health checkup that you can just go through. It's for free. Check it out on our website, and you can get some of the basics down. Check off all the things. You can see what you should be looking for, and then to go further, talk to a professional or get a partner. So that's the best thing you can do for yourself too.
Yeah,
just get started.
We always like to, we never like just getting people to do this without any kind of practical walkaways here. So some of the things that we really want to just kind of go through it, and I would love, Jimmy, let jump in anytime, is the thing, some of the things is privacy. Do you have a privacy policy? Do you know where the data is in your organization? And that's part of like a bigger asset conversation. But man, if you think about any kind of company that has, even if it's just your HR files for your staff, that's a privacy concern for your we did a review internally with our staff, and one of the questions that came up is said, where's our data located for our HR files? So I'm not going to say out loud where they are because that's not safe.
Somewhere safe.
That's low OPSEC. Yeah. But that being said, it was a great question because not most people, especially I think many people look at outside, but it's inside is just as dangerous.
Yeah, I think with that, having somebody defined as either like a chief privacy officer or just an individual that's assigned, to be
Yeah.
where, the buck stops here on your private data, being the owner of that data is
Right.
important to have that named and known, so that if when people do have those questions or something comes up, you know who to talk to about it.
Right. Right.
I
And
think a lot of people miss like where their data is actually sitting to. We have conversations every single day where it's like, okay, what do you care about? Okay, it's the HR data. It's this. Oh, well, that's protected in a SaaS application, or that's protected in, this thing. Oh, well, does anyone ever email that data? Oh,
Mhm.
yeah, we do that. And then, people start to realize
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
have those conversations. So the exercise of actually running through it, okay, what do we have? How is that being transferred? Who's responsible?
right.
It's very
Yeah.
important. I think a lot of people miss it.
Right. I'm a huge fan of if you can tabletop something and
Oh,
just
yeah.
walk through it and just keep like saying like, well, what about this and what about that? And I find that the more you do it, the more you start talking about it, then all of a sudden you start uncovering more and more and more. And all of a sudden, I found every time I've ever done it with a customer or even we've done internally, you always kind of have this like point where you're like, oh crap, this is really bad, because you
Mhm.
always start understanding your own. You start assigning a level of risk to something, which is
Yep.
you know. So actually, some other practical things we found is in the underwriting phase, like Leonard is saying, there's a lot of questions being asked now, right? I
yeah.
mean, I'm sure Leonard, I'm sure you're seeing them where people are asking certain things like 2FA, and what other things are you seeing
Exactly.
out there?
I was just going to bring that up. In terms of the doomsday scenarios that could be out there, it's imagine building a company for 20 or 30 years. Something goes wrong. Suddenly you're in jeopardy. You call your insurer, and the first thing they ask is, "Did you have 2FA?" And if you don't, they can easily make an argument that, well, unfortunately, we can't pay this out because you didn't focus on that. Because that business leader, they're not an IT person necessarily. They need
Right.
someone to help them to support all that. And
Yeah.
that happens all the time for all kinds of different reasons.
Yeah, I
Right.
feel like that's
I feel like-
the digital version of "Did you lock the door?"
Yeah.
It's like, you don't do that, Linky.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, that's on you.
the questions are starting to change too. Like 3, 4, 5 years ago, it was like, does someone regularly look at the logs?
Right.
Like, and there was one question. It was a checkbox, yes or no. And then it was like question 2: do you have cyber protections in place?
Yeah.
Now
Right.
it's much more detailed. They're looking for specific responses. They're looking for who's in charge of things, and even just the filling out of those forms requires a lot more expertise. Where before it was like a CFO filling it out, and got this. I got my cyber policy.
I said in our quarterly business reviews. That's one of the questions that we've been asking all the time. Like, hey, you have insurance? How do you handle it? Who did your policy? And more often than one, I admit, they're like, oh, we didn't even think to ask you. We're like,
Yeah.
well, we do
Well,
it every day, right? It's
yeah.
something that's really
Yeah.
important because they're so used to and I think there's another problem, Jimmy, that you highlighted, the CFO, COOs. It's insurance is like a business function, an operational function,
Yeah.
not
Mhm.
a technology function. So they don't even think to ask because, and also sometimes those policies are bundled in their E&O, they're bundled into their general business liability, and and the broker, and just because the broker is doing their job, they're trying to get them people mitigate the common risks that are happening, and they slide the cyber in there, but and so they don't think they have to do anything more or less than they had before, but they
Mhm.
really do. It's really changed quite a bit. So
People will miss too on their board. Like when these cyber attacks happens, a lot of times they'll go back to the board. Okay, was the board of directors actually enforcing these policies? Leading people where they talk about cybersecurity at the board level, and individual board member policies that will actually cover them in an incident. I think you're absolutely right. Cybersecurity needs to be part of the business conversation from the board and the executive function, not an IT afterthought.
Furthermore, I mean, that's a great example, and this is more for enterprises, but there are cyber insurance policies for board members because they create a whole nother level of risk. Just give you an example, I've known there were some investigations, not at Scout, but at other organizations we've worked on, where a board member, their phone photos were breached. and someone threatened to release them, which would affect, the sale of that company. At what point, how do you even begin to cover that in a policy?
Yeah.
But
Right.
it needs to be covered, and the insurance does exist. But that's the kind of depth that you have to go to understand where your risk is and what the pitfalls are for whatever your organization is or whatever size it is. So,
Right.
it's interesting in that everything's on the table. I think because of the infrastructure bill likely coming through later on in the summer, there's billions and billions earmarked for states, local governments, municipalities, educational institutes, police unions, things like that. So we're anticipating there's going to be an influx of funds, and people will then be thinking, well, where do I start? And I think they're going to start with what most organizations have been doing over the past 10 years, is starting to figure out, do I partner with someone? Do I piecemeal things together? And what they're going to realize very quickly is that they can't find the resources to do it internally. So that's where you guys come in. That's where we come in.
Absolutely.
And then we just start layering there. So I think we're going to have a very busy year over the next.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing is, if you don't do it day in, day out, you really don't have a sense of what's happening, right? And also, you're kind of in mid-market or small, medium, anything. If you're not focused on this, if you're focused on just doing day-to-day support, or even like you're just using the piece, just if you've never done it before, we do that on the MSP where people say, hey, we want to do this thing. And you're like, well, how many have you done? And they're like, 0, but we think we can figure it out. You're like, okay, but that's a really, really critical piece of infrastructure. So you should probably get a critical partner to help you to do that work.
Yeah.
Even if it's the engagement is limited just to owning the part of it that needs to be done, but bring someone that actually have done it before. And that's kind of why we end up working with Scout, because we're really good. We're really good IT people. We're really smart, I think. Actually, a lot of smart people work at Valiant, with Valiant. But when we looked at building our own SOC SIM, we were like, this is nuts. There's no way to build that. There's no way to build it. Right. And, and we had an experience building versus buying in the past that kind of informed our thinking. So we really, really want to make sure that, hey, we don't build things that don't need to be built when they're already built better and much more efficiently, so that we can bring the things to the partners, to our clients and our customers and the people that we support, so that they're protected. So we thought it was so important. But that's great.
I mean, it's been important for us to, and I think a lot of organizations will start doing this, start setting up a standard and, NIST, CIS, and that's what we stick to. Once you start going through that, the companies are going to start to understand where their gaps are. And these aren't, anyone with some cursory knowledge of your IT infrastructure can really get going on this kind of thing. But once you bring in a trusted partner, a critical partner, I think you can cover a lot more ground in terms of making sure that there are degrees of coverage that will make your company safer. And, given that ransomware is the killer out there right now, and over the last year especially, I think people can make some really good strides. So I'm excited for the next year. But I think everyone's going to be learning across the board how to move quickly and 100%. To do things in a safer way. And luckily, it looks like we'll have federal backing. It looks like there will be statutes in place to avoid things like the pipeline issue, which we've been talking about it for a decade now. I don't know how it's still happening, but here we are.
It's pretty terrifying that. And the only silver lining that I could take from it is that if it's a small ransomware event that shuts down gasoline for a week, causes the awareness that people need, maybe it was a good, sometimes a bad thing has to happen for a good thing to happen. And I know that
a wake up call be, something that's an inconvenience rather than something catastrophic.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, you start going through doomsday scenarios. This is just people putting gasoline in a plastic bag, which is dangerous, by the way. We highly recommend. Highly recommend not doing that.
Power grid shutdown for the Eastern Seaboard. I'd rather learn the lesson before it gets to that point.
Exactly. So, anyway, I mean, I think this is a great stream. I think there's so much information here.
Yeah.
Leonard, Jimmy, do you have anything else you want to throw in here before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, go ahead, Jimmy. So I would just say, for companies that are looking into this, talk to your current provider, talk to your broker, really get as much information as you can. They want to make money. They want to go through the doomsday scenarios, but you're going to have to hold their feet to the fire. And I think they're going to move along with the market, along with what we're researching. But we're keeping an eye on it too. And, I think we have some really cool things which we're working on, which we'll be able to release to Valiant, release to the larger audiences over the next couple months.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think another thing too, as people are they think of looking at cyber insurance and cyber liability insurance, an important question that you have, even if you already have that, is who are you going to call? What is that number if a cyber incident happens or if you have a cyber problem? And a lot of people can't answer that. So
Right.
I'll leave people with that.
Right.
It should probably be Valiant.
Yeah.
Ghostbusters. Oh,
unfortunately, the word. Yeah, exactly. You have to start there, and I think that it's you start putting together and it goes back to that NIST CSF framework. One of the key components of it is putting together your incident response plan. Having a plan is just a first step, but it's one that so many companies don't do, and it goes back. So. It's really great advice.
Just these are the 5 people we're going to get in a room to figure it out. Having that is light years beyond having to figure out wait, who should be involved in the middle of something going on.
Exactly.
If your answer is, I'm going to call up my insurance company in the middle of all the computers getting encrypted, it's there's probably
there's
call them, but maybe
So there's so much to this, and is it a vast topic? So we just scratched the surface, but I really want to say, Jimmy, Leonard, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and the knowledge, and we'll hope to have you on again. And it was really great having you here. So once again, would love if anyone has any questions or thoughts and any kind of comments, please leave them on our YouTube page. Send them up to our questions. And so actually our next stream next week is our 2021 midpoint review. We're right there. So we're talking about where we are at the point, and anything you want us to cover on that, shoot it to us. That'd be great. So with that, Jimmy, Leonard, thank you so much. Megan, Marion, Justin, thank you as always. And I'll see you guys next week.
Bye,
thank you.
everyone.
All right.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.